So as I said, I've been treating prostate cancer a long time, actually, from the very beginning, and I've seen it evolve a lot. And there's been a lot of side issues that have come along with it. And what I saw years ago when I started was a lot of patients with an interest in using cannabis in varying forms. This is particularly common in British Columbia. I guess it's our #1 cash crop and always has been, but now at least it's our #1 legal cash crop. So basically, now that it's legal, there's a lot more patients and other people getting interested in its various properties, and you'll look online and see everybody promise everything about it. It apparently is going to cure everything. But if it did that, I'd have a lot more investment in it, and I don't have any. So I've labeled my talk as Cannabis and Prostate Cancer, Adding Confusion to Already Muddy Waters. The reason being that there's very little actual solid evidence on a lot of the stuff about cannabis. There's been difficulties for a long time in trying to get studies done. You'll also notice that I'm going to intentionally call it cannabis whenever I can. The word marijuana, which is traditionally used, and even on the Health Canada handouts for physicians, it's called medicinal marijuana. Marijuana was a made-up name by the Americans back in Reefer Madness era when they wanted it to sound foreign so that people wouldn't use it. So they tried to make it sound Mexican by actually changing the name. But the actual name of the two plants is Cannabis indica and Cannabis sativa, and that's never changed, and that's how we name all plants. So why they changed it and keep it going, I don't know. But it was sort of a misinformation campaign back then, and I'll stick to the real wording. That one. So first of all, this one usually we jump by really quick with most talks whenever we're talking about things, and most people have a whole list of drug companies and everything that have given them money and stuff like that, and we have to tell you about that so that you know we're not biased. So I can honestly say that I have never received a dime from anybody or any company that makes cannabis or gotten paid for any talks that I give. I just do this for, I guess I have nothing better to do on a Saturday morning. I was going to play video games, but I thought I'd come here. I'll play video games when I go home. So what is cannabis? As I mentioned, Cannabis indica and Cannabis sativa are the two original plants that actually were there. Most plants nowadays, though, because this is a male-female plant, so when you're actually making varying strains of it, you actually will mix those together. And that's what's coming up with a lot of the really colorful names that you'll see about the different strains. But basically, those two plants used to be individual, but the hybrid plants are far more durable, they're better against pests and so on. So a lot of the licensed producers producing things now are often giving what's called a hybrid. So they're giving something that's one direction or the other or right in the middle. And the difference between the plants are physically there. The indica dominant strains are typically a short plant with big broad leaves, whereas these ones have higher cannabidiol content. And the sativa plants are more energizing and they have a bit more THC in them typically. The sativa plant is actually usually tall with skinny leaves. Now the funny thing about it is everybody that sees that nice picture of the leaves and everything, there's actually not a lot of THC or CBD or anything in the leaves. It's in the buds that happen when the female plant gets fertilized and you do it properly. And those big buds come off, and that's what's actually used. Now, we've probably got evidence that cannabis is the earliest known medicine we probably have ever used as medicine. I think it's back to about 4,500 years with fossil evidence, and in multiple countries around the world, because this plant, maybe they call it weed because it is a weed, it can grow anywhere. And people are like in India and other countries, it's just growing off wild, basically. If that happened here, we'd have all kinds of high school kids out basically clearing it out for us and making sure that we didn't have to worry about it. Try and get them to weed your garden that way. Probably won't happen. One thing that's interesting is when you look at the way the different buds look, there's actually a dramatic difference in the different appearance, smell, taste, and also the effects of the different strains. One of the things with the different strains that's interesting is it actually has these really clever little names. So when you look at something like Purple Kush or Sour Diesel or OG Kush, it's actually funny because say OG Kush came from Lemon OG and then Bubba Kush. So they put them together and made a new name. So when the plants get mixed together, there's funny names like Death Star and Romulan. Obviously some people that were into science fiction and other things were naming these things. We're not going to say that all the original producers of the cannabis strains were legitimate, but they were certainly creative. Maybe they had a little before they named it. So what is cannabis itself? There's actually over 500 different compounds already known to be in cannabis. So when you actually do a full extract and you do detailed studies to see what's there, There's a whole bunch, and I've listed the basic ones that are there. And this includes the second, which is the THC we always think of, and then the CBD is the other one, the CBDA, the one that is more typically referred to. So everybody, when you read about or hear about a strain of cannabis or drops or extracts, you'll see things like THC and CBD content. And it's really, really important, especially because now with the recreational market. So they've switched everything over now so that only licensed producers are able to sell. So there was a gray market for the first while it became legal, and people were selling stuff that individual growers were making and stuff. But now only the official licensed producers can do it. And if there isn't a club near your house that's selling, you can do it online, and they can deliver it within 24 hours even. It's almost as good as Amazon. So basically, but when you're buying and when you're looking into what to do, you have to have some background knowledge about what it is, or usually each one of the clubs or the stores you go to will have certainly one or two really good experts. They won't always look like experts. Some of them will have a whole lot of tattoos and piercings, and they'll look like they came in off some really strange kind of artsy thing, but they really do know their stuff. I know the Compassion Club in Vancouver at 14th and Commercial, where I did some of my research, and I also have worked with some of them for quite a while. They're the, I think, only truly not-for-profit society in existence in Vancouver or stuff for selling cannabis. And in fact, they all make low wages, the staff. They actually give most of their cannabis out at reduced prices. So they actually have much better prices than the guys that are trying to make money off us all. And unfortunately, it's easier to go to the guy trying to make money than to go all the way into Vancouver. And the one in Vancouver does require an official doctor's note. It's very simple, just to sign the form and send it in. But they've kept that going because they only sell medicinal. So there's really no difference, though, in many of the medicinal versus the, we'll call them recreational strains. So when you're thinking about using something, you don't have to go to a medicinal shop because everybody's selling the same stuff now for the most part. Now, these compounds, a couple of them we know exactly what they do, but a lot of them we're finding out more and more, they don't just affect the flavor or the taste or the smell, but they actually do have other roles. And there's whole families of compounds like terpenes and these other chemicals in there as well that have unknown effects. And there are people trying to isolate those chemicals right now, doing a lot of basic science research on like, what does this particular one do? And that's where sometimes the cancer patients will come in here, oh, someone told me that, you know, this particular CBG thing is better for prostate cancer or something. I'll tell you right now that it's all early evidence, and realistically, there's no evidence yet of effective treatment, but I'll get into some of that. At least treatment for the cancer itself, not mentioning symptoms. That's different. When you actually use cannabis, generally it's activated, it has to be decarboxylated, and it's usually by heating or burning. So vaporizers are preferred, of course, over smoking, just because we're a cancer agency, we always have to say that. The largest studies on chronic cannabis smokers, if they didn't smoke cigarettes, though, actually from a respirologist at the World Meeting, actually had said that there was no increased rates of smoking-related cancers or emphysema from smoking chronic cannabis, which seems counterintuitive, so just in case, we encourage regular users that are inhaling it instead of eating it to use a vaporizer. Now, those are not those things you see with the car where it fills up with vapor and it's coming out the windows like the kids are doing now. So don't worry, those weird lung diseases that young kids are getting because they're smoking these weird new e-cigarettes and everything, that's totally different. A vaporizer simply is a little chamber that heats up the cannabis instead of burning it, and you breathe in the vapor. So the nice thing about it is it doesn't smell like if you smoke it. That way your neighbors don't all know exactly what you're up to. Sometimes people care. Some neighborhoods, they don't care. And if you go on any campground in British Columbia, they don't care because you'll walk to the bathroom and you'll walk by 3 different campsites and smell it. So when they're heated up, this whole list of compounds here was the same as the other list. It's just slightly changed so that it's an activated form. If you actually take raw cannabis, which some people are doing, and they're juicing it, or they're blending it up, or they're extracting it with liquid but never heating it, or not doing a proper way of activating the compounds, some people are doing this, and they're doing large volumes of cannabis, and we don't really know that that has any value. I had a patient once that actually, I guess their aunt wanted to be nice for them, so they took a whole bunch of ground up weed and basically threw it in a brownie recipe, and then just baked it. And I was kind of like, no, that's not how it works. You have to look on the internet. So actually, for people who like to bake and things, the reason we put it in cookies and brownies and all those good things, cannabis tastes awful. So those nice liquid extracts that they tell you to put under your tongue and stuff, once you start to taste that bad taste, drink something that tastes better. So that's why it sort of started that way. Now, there's been all these ad campaigns too about baked goods and lock up your baked goods because your kids and grandkids are going to get at it. Well, your kids, if some of you guys, your kids are probably old enough, so it's okay. But I know my kids aren't. So, but at the same time, we don't lock up our alcohol, most of us. We don't lock up the prescription drugs that we have, and all of those are far more dangerous. So I always find it kind of amusing. But we always try and do what we can. Now, the actual reason cannabis works and does anything in people is very important. There's an entire system of enzymes and receptors in your body that are in almost every tissue of your body that are part of this thing we call the endocannabinoid system. So endo just means inside you, and cannabinoids are the whole compounds of the cannabis products. This is a system that's evolved in all kinds of different species. We've seen examples where animals are eating cannabis and stuff and actually seem to be quite enjoying themselves. Kind of like those drunken squirrels when someone leaves the cherries on too long or whatever, right? Now, these complex pathways actually connect to everything from your gut to your brain to all the different systems of your body. Now, one of the problems with this is even though they're there and they're spread all over the place, it's not necessarily true that taking outside cannabinoids, whether you're smoking, inhaling, eating, or anything, is going to be the dominant thing that will change that pathway, but it certainly does influence it, and we see that in a lot of studies. So I said here there's many changes examining studies examining the changes and interactions relating, but nobody fully understands it yet. It's too complicated and it meshes with every other system in your body. So there's individual things where someone will have inflammatory bowel disease and say, oh, it works really well, or someone will have multiple sclerosis and they've seen some benefits, and of course in other examples. But a lot of it's poorly understood. I think the original one was always glaucoma, and that's how everybody used to say, oh, I'm smoking this for my glaucoma. And that seemed to work really well for people for a long time. So one of the things that's important when we look at it with regard to its role in the cell is you'll see the CB1 and CB2 receptors. These are the cannabis receptors on the cells, wherever they might be. And inside that cell, this gets really messy and complicated, but basically it affects apoptosis pathways, which are cell death, say for cancer cells and things like that. Cell proliferation, so the growth of cells can be modified in the case of growing cancer cells or any other cells. And then when we look at DNA synthesis and lipid synthesis, and as you see on the top there, there's ion channels controlling things that are going in and out of the cells. So it's a really complicated thing where downstream it has a lot of effects inside you. And that's all not even well understood, but it's that connection to things like apoptosis and cell growth that has a lot of people excited about its possible role in the treatment of cancer, even as a direct treatment. But we're not there yet. Now, this is a rather busy slide as well, but you'll notice this is again just to show that there's a lot of other systems involved. So we actually see things like analgesia, obviously for pain, anti-inflammatory, with some of the different compounds. You'll see CBD on the top has all kinds of benefits. And actually CBD is really nice in the sense that if you have a pure CBD product, there's no THC. You're not intoxicated at all. The hard thing with CBD is to figure out what dose to take because you can't feel it. It's really good for anxiety and it's really good for nerve pain. So for a lot of patients, especially my prostate guys with collapsing spines and pinched nerves and sciatic pain and all this other exciting stuff, all that burning and tingling and other stuff, it can be really well managed. And I've actually seen patients completely avoid opiates in some cases, which are obviously far more dangerous and filled with side effects in preference of just using CBD. Now that's rare to be able to totally avoid it, but it has a definite role. You'll see other things about anti-anxiety, and that's one that's really good for CBD as well. And in fact, in our cannabis group, the practitioners group, we actually have a psychiatrist that's been using pure CBD strains of cannabis for a while now to treat anxiety disorders, because it's far better than popping Ativan all day and all of the other potentially, well, fraught with side effects and even potentially addictive medications. Now, looking at the rest, you'll just see there's basically a whole lot of different things, and it's not all the CBD and it's not all THC. And that's even what we knew from a few years back, and it's just grown since then. Now, I guess the basic question of can cannabis treat prostate cancer? So the actual answer I have to always give is no. And in fact, regularly we get emails from different physicians around the country, and as mentioned now around the world. I think we got somebody in Uruguay that's on our group somehow. I don't know how they found out about us. But basically questions come up all the time about what's the dose, what's the schedule to treat cancer. And myself and a few other medical oncologists in the group, as well as Dr. Hawley, one of our pain and symptom expert docs from Vancouver. She's actually the head of the whole palliative care division for BC Cancer. She's also spouted out the same answers back, and that's that we don't have any evidence, and we keep trying to convince people to stop jumping from test tube experiments to humans. There's a whole lot of steps in between when we do any other drug. So for all of these new ones for prostate cancer, we've had to prove them in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 studies before we can even think of offering it outside of a study. And actually many of those drugs will get through phase 1 and phase 2 and look pretty good. And I've seen even ones that look totally made sense, it looked like it should work fine, got to phase 2, did really good, and a large phase 3 study, which is just before we can give it to everybody, totally failed and the drug was useless. Now, that's where the drug companies have to invest all that money, which is supposedly why they charge so much for all the medicines they sell us. But luckily in British Columbia, when you have prostate cancer and any other cancer, if it's a proven medicine that works, it's always free. That's the nicest thing about being in Canada. So the Americans, for instance, some of those people that don't have good health plans, even if you've got an 80% coverage, your 20% deductible might be $1,000 a month for your drugs or more. So it's actually really important when things are covered. And right now we don't have any coverage for cannabis, and I have not yet heard of an extended care plan, for instance, even covering the cost of cannabis, but you can always try and slip that in, especially if it's coming from a legitimate licensed producer. But I think they're starting to make rules on it because it didn't used to be a question. Now it's become more of a question. But most of the time it is just something that you have to get on your own. Now there's been, as I said, a series of these test tube and animal experiments that would show shrinkage of tumors or show death of cancer cells. Now I always tell my patients, I go, look, if I give you a test tube and we put certain extracts of cannabis in, sure, it might kill those cancer cells. Same time, if I give you a bottle of vodka and you pour a little bit in there, those cancer cells will die. But I'm not going to give you a bottle of vodka and say, go treat your cancer. So we can't exactly extrapolate. And that's what's been happening, unfortunately. And in fact, people like the FDA and Health Canada have been trying to put out warnings to help people, all the patients that are desperately looking for answers, to say, look, don't give up on regular therapy. Cannabis is not a substitute for that. And whether it's the FDA in the States or Health Canada, they've all come up with the same recommendations to sort of keep in mind that all these other treatments that your doctors offer work. Prostate cancer has changed hugely in 14 years. I used to have to give 85-year-old men chemo. Now I got these great drugs that I got 98-year-old guys on, and they can continue to take them for years, and it keeps everything under control without any of the side effects we used to have to do. So it does get better and better. Now, there is some evidence I'd mentioned about the cannabigerol with their CBG idea and whether that might be particularly more cytotoxic, especially in prostate, but there's not a really evidence to say we can take that and use it. So as I said, it's a huge trap, and I don't mean that in a reference to Star Wars or anything, but basically we can't assume that that basic science is going to convert, but it's very, very interesting, and it's a great thing to bring studies forward. So there are also case examples and things like that of people with cancer who've used it. Well, sadly, they've all usually died, but the question of whether it impacted their survival is unknown. So most of them were already giving up or finished up with regular therapy. Now, despite the lack of good human trials, as I mentioned, many patients are using cannabis ostensibly to treat their cancer. And when patients come to see me and I see whatever cancer they have, and they say, oh, I'm taking cannabis in whatever form, the first question I ask is why? Because I want to know that they're not taking it to treat their cancer, but taking it to treat their symptoms. So if they say, I'm treating my pain, I've got anxiety, I need this for my appetite, I gotta basically be able to eat enough, I'm losing weight, which I know sadly for prostate guys is not usually a problem. They all gain weight. It's not their fault to all the women in the audience, it's my fault. I take their hormones away, and therefore they have to actually find, well, it turns them into kind of postmenopausal women, and I don't mean that offensively. But you guys can battle over who gets worse hot flushing sometimes. So for anyone that's on, yeah, some people get that one right away. So basically, there's products out there like Phoenix Tears that we've heard all about, and Rick Simpson oil, and a whole bunch of other ones out there. And there's websites and everything. You can buy it from them, and they've got all these great products that look great. And none of it has been tested at all. So theoretically, you don't even know what you're getting, but usually at least you will be getting cannabis. Now, if we did that with any other product, there'd be real heck to pay, shall we say, if we tried to suddenly start selling things online before we did a study. Here we go. Oh, that's just a lot of fine print that basically says the same thing. So there's a lot of misleading and false claims about it. Same thing with everything. Every year there's something new. You'll think back, there was a book years ago, Sharks Don't Get Cancer. When the guy wrote the book, there were 19 different types of cancer already documented in sharks. So the FDA said, you can't actually say the title of your book. But what he really meant to say was, sharks get cancer less than humans. And then the FDA said, well, eating something of an animal that gets less cancer than you do doesn't have any role at all in preventing cancer in you. And they did study it, and it didn't work. So now it's only used for, I guess, soup when you're in a nice restaurant in China or something like that. Or in Richmond, potentially. I know I've been there. Actually, that's where I grew up. So, can cannabis treat prostate cancer? The yes portion is important. So it's particularly useful in the symptoms. So a lot of guys that have advanced prostate cancer especially, they've got bone metastases. We see it in more than 90% of prostate cancer. And those, for some people, not all, will cause damage and pain. And in addition, well, let's say most of us, I'm turning 50 this year, so I always tell everyone 50 and up's got arthritis. It just doesn't matter who you are. So we see it on x-rays all the time, and of course, as we get into our 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond, those aches and pains can actually be as bad as sometimes some of the more serious pains. But it definitely does help for the treatment of that. Nausea is interesting because when we give chemo, which rarely we give for prostate cancer now, there are certain exceptions and we do still use it regularly. In fact, we found a way to use the same chemo early on in advanced disease to get a much greater benefit than what we used to. But one of the problems with all chemo, people worry about nausea. So we've got things like Gravol and metoclopramide and these other drugs, and then we got special chemo drugs like ondansetron, and then we got this expensive new one, aprepitant, which is $90 for 3 pills. And when that fails, cannabis can work. And when I use cannabis for nausea like that, I also still make them take the other medicines. But I've had patients, and they're usually young guys with testes cancer or something like that, because we give them nasty chemo, because we got 99% plus cure rates, so we can put them through anything because it's going to cure them. And they're all like 20 years old or something like that, so they can handle it. But I've had some who couldn't handle the intensity of the nausea without the benefit of cannabis. Or so they claimed. Maybe they just wanted to use cannabis. I think I was actually doing something at the Cannabis Club in Vancouver once, and I happened to see one of my patients there, and I was like, you haven't been on chemo since last year? And he goes, yeah, but this form you filled out lasts a year. And I found that amusing. Okay, and that was just before it became legal, so I certainly wasn't worried. Appetite's a huge issue. Oh, sorry, pain I sort of skipped over quickly. So as I mentioned, CBD is good for nerve pain, but if you have generalized more like damaged joint pain, things like that, then a mix of THC and CBD is often very valuable. Dr. Holly, who's our pain expert, basically, she's actually doing studies right now in Vancouver in the pain clinic at the cancer agency there, where they're actually incorporating cannabis in some of their treatment. And we've reviewed all the charts previously. That was part of my research leave, where we actually went and looked through, and people got better value of pain control from actual cannabis than they did from even the attempted prescription products to mimic it. So we've had Nabilone, this pill with just THC in it. We've had that for decades now, I think. And it was supposed to be this super great nausea pill that was going to be as good as cannabis. And it really turned into a mediocre nausea pill that costs more than actually going out and buying cannabis. So really very few people use it except if they're really having trouble. Same idea when we do liquid extracts and things. What Dr. Hawley has generally recommended, as most of our group members have recommended, is this 1-to-1 THC CBD. And the reason for that, you get the benefits of both, but the CBD is more bringing you down and relaxing. Because when you get THC, the psychiatrist in our group likes to say the best way to think about its impact on your brain is it's kind of like having an equalizer and turning everything up to 10. So if there's that dripping water over there, you'll really hear that. If there's traffic outside, you'll hear it. If you have a shower, you'll feel each and every drop of water individually. And for some people, that's overwhelming. So this is why, unless you've been using before, you used as a kid or whatever it might be, some people, when they're first starting, they really have to start low and go slow, whether it's inhaled or oral, because of the fact that you could get overwhelmed. And that's what causes that paranoia that people talk about in some of the strains, and people that are having these adverse reactions at times. And they're often young people just smoking too much, but also some of the new strains, you'll get 27% THC and 0 CBD. So there's nothing to balance it out. So when you get an extract that has both, yes, it's intoxicating to some degree, but that'll also let you know the dose, because doses are generally self-titrated. Chronic users will need more, and over time you might need a little bit more, but also depending on how bad your symptoms are, there may be a certain amount you need or don't need. One thing about it is that when we take it inhaled, it can last about 2 to 3 hours. And officially, I think it was the Canadian Family Practice Guidelines said 3 hours at least before you could ever drive after that. And we like to be very careful about that. Eating it, it actually doesn't even peak. So when you inhale it or vaporize it or smoke it or do something like that, it affects you in seconds to minutes. And very quickly, you just take a puff or two, you put it down. And you can do another one or two and put it down. And you figure out, you feel it in your body and go, okay, I'm at the right level. But if you take a liquid extract or a piece of a cookie or a piece of a brownie, it's going to take 3 hours to peak. And you won't even feel anything by 1 hour. I always tell my patients the cookie story. I had one big guy. He was very young. He didn't have prostate cancer, but his friend made cookies all the time, apparently. So he came to me one day when he's going on chemo, and he says, hey, my friend made these cookies. And I said, I want you to be very careful with them. I said, take just a quarter of the cookie on that first day and just eat that and wait at least 3 hours, see how you feel. And then the next day, you can think about taking a bigger piece of cookie. But of course, he's a man. What can you do? He ate the whole cookie. And he waited 1 hour, and he said, I didn't feel anything yet, so I ate a second cookie. Okay, this is the warning. He spent the next 8 to 10 hours in bed, curled up, just kind of trying to relax because he was all really revved up. And the one thing that's interesting, as I said, it's probably one of the safest drugs out there. The actual lethal dose estimated for cannabis would be you'd have to smoke 900 joints in 45 minutes. So if you can do that, I'm really impressed, because that's way beyond Cheech and Chong and everybody else from back in the day. Even when they had that van made out of cannabis, it wouldn't happen. And what's interesting about that, as you laugh about Cheech and Chong, is Cheech never smoked cannabis. It was all fake. Chong did. You could see that later on in the years, because he really did way too much. All right. So there's a lot of acute effects with regard to memory and other things like that, but a lot of this stuff really goes away when you're not using it. So it doesn't always impair you completely. And you'll stay in a lot more control than if you had too many drinks. In fact, as a recreational drug, I find it's far safer than alcohol, because alcohol kills 100,000 people a year in the US alone, directly due to its toxic effects, not counting drinking and driving and all the other stuff. So it's funny how we'll celebrate one thing and put it on TV and advertise it and everything, and Stanley Cup, everything else, they're pouring it everywhere, and it's actually killing people. But we're okay with that, but we're going to make cannabis illegal. The reason cannabis was originally illegal was all about money. So back in the same time of that reefer madness, DuPont Chemical made nylon rope. So their competition was hemp. They weren't fighting cannabis, they were fighting hemp. They put millions into false advertising. Standard Oil in the States did the same thing, as did the paper industry, because you could actually get more paper from an acre of cannabis or hemp than you could from trees, and faster and better on the environment. So they didn't want the competition. Now, of course, it's become legal again, and the same reason, money. Now there's this huge recreational market. They know they can tax it. They're going to make billions, and that's good for them. So that seems to be a sad point, but money seems to be driving the world this way. Now, there's been a lot of different reviews in other areas, and we know that there's good value to this. The marijuana handout for physicians that's given by Health Canada has 1,000 references in it. So obviously there's a lot of evidence behind it in studies that have been done, as limited as they were. The reason a lot of research wasn't done before is because the only source for cannabis was from the National Institute for Drug Abuse in the US. And they only gave cannabis out for studies that were looking at negative impact of cannabis. So a lot of doctors started getting clever and making up a study saying they're looking for a negative thing, and actually found a positive thing and happened to publish it. So people are smart, they find ways around. And that should improve in future. One of the problems, as I mentioned, Pippa Hawley, she's doing these pain studies in Vancouver in the pain clinic at the Cancer Center. And in prostate cancer, one of the problems I really get, and I tell my patients every time I see them, it's all about, are you guys walking, are you active, are you exercising? Because if we steal away all your testosterone, you can't make muscle as much as you normally could. And everybody, I had this big 350-pound biker enforcer guy. At the end of his disease, he had trouble walking to the bathroom. And he used to put people through walls. So basically, it's one of those things that you always have to keep in mind. Like, we know exercising is important, especially when we retire and stuff. We all actually do this. Apparently, there's been new studies for all these early retirees that take off when they're 55. And I won't mock that, because that's my plan in 5 years. But what they do is they all get exercising and they don't do anything with their brain. So they go from 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day of using their brain to not using it at all. So 10 years later, their brain is mush. So you really have to do both brain and body. And for those guys that all think walking is a really good exercise, and it is, don't forget your upper body. Because one day you're going to grab hold of something to hold yourself up and you're not going to have the strength. So doing a little bit of balance things is what I always encourage. But the demotivation, and sometimes, especially on an indica strain of cannabis, it just makes you really too relaxed so that you don't bother doing it. And we've already taken testosterone away, so that's our natural drive just to get up and do things too. So unless you're really mentally driven and one of those guys that's go, 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 you really have to, I always tell patients, just keep walking. So if you use cannabis, just don't sit down until you're really ready to sit down and you're not planning on getting up. Because you'll sit down in that chair and look over to the kitchen and go, okay, I'm really hungry, but that's too far. And you're just gonna sit there and watch TV. I do recommend things like Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle. These are the modern versions of stoner movies, basically. Pineapple Express was a good one. You know, there's all kinds of them. But you don't always have to watch those, I'm kidding. You can watch nice award-winning stuff. So that's a mix of things, and I never quite know what people are really interested in. So when I give a talk like this, I try and outline some of the basic science without overwhelming you with a whole lot of nonsense that even I don't even care about sometimes. And at the same time, connect it to clinical stuff, connect it to use where we're using orally or inhaled.
Dabbling a little bit with edibles from the legal store there, which is really nice because you know how much you're getting.
Yep.
10 milligrams seems to be a good starting point. But I found that there was a fine line between euphoria and paranoia. The euphoria part is really nice, and I'd like to go back to doing that again, but I don't want to freak out because right now, the big C is on my mind all the time, so I don't,
Well,
So I've talked to some people and they say, oh, well, do indica instead of sativa.
yes.
But, what you say is there's more THC in indica.
No, there's more THC in sativa. The sativa is the daytime one, really. And it's more likely going to raise you up and get you a little paranoid and beyond euphoria, more into that place you don't want to go. And some of it's dose, but if you use an indica, you can use an indica in the daytime. The only problem is that for some people, if it's a really harsh indica, it might make you too tired. But there's a lot of, we'll call them hybrids, that are right in the middle or edging over towards indica, so that they're a little bit more mellow and less likely to cause the paranoia. But it's also a dose thing. Were you inhaling or were you eating?
I won't inhale anything because I'm scared of going back to smoking again. So
Okay.
I eat it, and like you say, you gotta wait. You don't want
Yeah.
to do out.
The trick
By the
is,
way, I had some really nice caramels that were awesome, and those you should lock up and not let your kids at because they will eat them all and they'll be in Disneyland for 6 weeks.
the same is actually true with regard to things like that. If you're making like fuzzy navels and stuff, so all of the sweet liqueurs, you got to put them way up high because your kids will like those too. But the idea ends up being is, I know in Seattle, for instance, in the stores down there, they were making these great little cinnamon candies that were very small, and you could easily titrate a dose by using more than one candy. So as you know, they do tell you how much is in it. So that's a great way to do it. One of the problems we've had is consistency of edibles, because they had, unfortunately, the week after the Supreme Court ruled that you had to make cannabis available in forms other than dried herb, because we had 4-year-old kids with seizure disorders, and we weren't expecting them to go outside and smoke a doobie. It just seemed wrong. But basically, because they changed that rule, then the clubs had to stop making their own. Now, I know the Compassion Club, for instance, makes ready-made butter, and it's nice and consistent in its dose, and you can give it to your wife or your daughter or whoever else, and they can mix it in their favorite chocolate chip cookie recipe and basically mix it up for you. But it's about the exact dose, but switching the strain sometimes helps.
I appreciate what you said about the one-to-one with the CBD, because CBD, to me, from what I've seen, is more of a placebo for most people. It's like, well, I put it on and I think it works, but...
The best way to know is CBD is really good. Like if anyone, I don't know if anyone in the room gets like sciatic type pain or like those burning, tingling after whatever treatment where you're getting numbness and tingling and other things from nerve irritation. It's very, very good for that. So those people can actually feel a clear difference. But you're right, that's the problem with CBD. That's why when people are selling it as treatment, they just keep going higher and higher doses because nobody knows, because you can't feel it. And it doesn't even have much of an adverse impact. There's been some rare cases these days, and I think the pharmacies are keeping track of it, of certain drugs, prescription drugs, that may or may not change a bit because of high levels of things like CBD. But finding that balance is really important, and it's like a moving target, depending on you and how much you've used and how big you are and how much fat versus other things. Because remember, the first time you use it, it distributes to the fat. So as I always joke, it's like basically those teenagers at parties that are smoking it for the first time, they're pretending to be high. They know what they're supposed to act like, so they do. But instantly it goes from their blood level and it drops and goes into their fat. Now if they stay at the party all night and keep smoking, yes, they're stoned. But you'll find the same thing when you're using it initially, it's sort of building up in your body. And that's one of the advantages too, because that's why there's no significant withdrawal symptoms. Because it slowly leaches out of the fat to come back. So depending on where you're at and how long, if you've taken a break and gone back on, your dose may change. And if they make edibles, or if it's not an extract that's really clear, edibles are always variable because your stomach absorption is highly different. When you eat something, it goes also through the liver, and that first pass through the liver, it breaks down probably half the product, which is why the more immediate direct route is something inhaled. But again, we don't like to encourage smoking. And people also want that long-lasting benefit. So it's the same as a short or long-acting painkiller. It'll last all day instead of lasting only a few hours. So it's a bit tricky, but you have to kind of do it as you go. There's a few websites as well, things like leafly.com and a few others where they've actually got a whole menu of all different strains. And Leafly, like L-E-A-F-L-Y. I think it's .com, not .ca. But it basically, I think they usually will direct you to where you can get strains as well. But if you're looking at your local club or your local location and they're saying they have these strains, you can look them up and they'll actually have a little graphing type system of all the feedback from people that have used it and reviewed it, because they affect people differently. So you will find some where people say, oh, dry mouth is horrible, and other ones where they'll say, oh, you're really, really great for depression or great for anxiety or great for pain, and it'll rank it. They used to be these beautiful little graphs, but I think they recently changed it. But it's based on how people felt. And that's really useful because these strains, as much as we kind of know what's in them, they only really measure CBD and THC. So even when you buy a package something, it has nothing about all the other things in there. And those are the two dominant chemicals by far. So looking things up to see what your symptoms are. That's why if you go to a good club, any of the producers around now, there's usually a guy there and you can tell him, hey, look, I'm doing this for pain, I'm doing this for whatever, I'm doing this for appetite, what would you recommend? And they'll usually recommend a couple of different things to try. But again, it's always trial and error. You try it and you see how it makes you feel. And when you find your strain that's your favorite, you write it down and remember. And then you try and say, okay, this has worked before. And if it's not available because of supply, they can say, okay, this would be similar, and they'll keep you matched up with something. There's also ideas that we've seen where changing your strain once in a while, even changing the location in which you use cannabis, can actually change how you feel. It's very anecdotal, but we've seen it again and again.
Thanks.
Is there any more questions?
Now, she looks like a baker.
Talk a bit about the connection between cannabis and compromised kidneys.
So far, I haven't seen any connection between cannabis and compromised kidneys.
So somebody who had compromised kidneys would be safe taking.
Well, everything always depends on dose, of course. So if any of the compounds within the cannabis are cleared by the kidneys, they may take a lower dose. But each person's different anyway. So if you're using it, you're always supposed to, especially with oral, start low and go slow. So day by day by day. Even if it's CBD, and it's tricky to see if you can feel it, if you start to feel symptoms improve, you'll know you're at the right and a safe dose. But if you start to actually get overwhelmed by side effects from the medicine, then you'll know. But that's only going to really happen in something with a blend of THC and CBD for the most part.
I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Midnight Express, but it always makes me worried about traveling and pot. So what if I have
Can't you reach? Oh, there he is. Yep.
What if I have a medicinal license from you to get it? What is it, or how does it work to travel?
Well, the good thing is within Canada, nobody really tries to stop you ever. Personal amounts, there's actually set limits, and I believe they're on the national or the government type websites that'll tell you that you can personally carry about X number of grams at a time of different products and be safe. The other thing is you keep it in the original containers from the licensed producers so that nobody's going to think that it's actually illegal pot. But the idea ends up being just like prescription drugs when you travel. It's always nicer to keep them in their own containers. Now, sadly, even Washington State, even though it's legal there and it's legal here, it's not legal at the border. So you got to pop those candies in your mouth or whatever really quick when you hit the border, because basically there's rules that prevent that. So you can never travel internationally and take it. And even if you're traveling the other way, I guess it's probably better in your carry-on to have it and have it in that plastic bag with your liquids and stuff when you go through security if you're taking it there. But always double check with the airlines if you're taking it across the country. And if you know you're traveling somewhere and you have friends there, you can actually have them deliver cannabis to that location so that it's there when you arrive as opposed to you carrying it yourself. And I've had patients do that before where they're going to visit family because they just don't feel comfortable going through security even on a Canada to Canada flight because of the potential for trouble. Nobody wants to be taken in the back room and searched, right?
Conrad, what's your answer to when you go across the border to the border guards and they ask you, have you had cannabis?
Always say no. Sorry, that's on tape. But basically, you don't want to ever get on somebody's blacklist or anything like that. And unfortunately, our neighbors to the south are a little bit less enlightened still in some aspects. So even though certain states like Colorado and now California and I believe Oregon as well as Washington State are all saying, yes, it's legal, a lot of that's still medicinal. But the idea is if you cross a border and you tell them, hey, I use cannabis, then you're going to be like, oh, well, let's check your vehicle.
So if we have somebody here who would be interested due to their pain management and everything to be in contact with you, because we know there's a limited amount of practitioners in the province that are familiar with cannabis as you are, how would they just get a referral to you?
Well, the easy thing is, for instance, prostate cancer in the Surrey Center, we've really only got, well, okay, Dr. Shustik does a little bit, but there's really only 3 of us that do most of the prostate cancer treatment from the standpoint of medical oncology. And if I know Lily Lee and Krista Noonan know that I'm fully aware of all this other stuff, so if they ever have questions, they always just come to me anyway. So for the other doctors and stuff, they all know, and if someone has a question, they ask me, they ask Dr. Hawley, so we can always do it that way. But a lot of times, physicians, and this is a problem to some degree higher level, at the BC College of Physician level, a lot of times they don't want to have doctors getting into using cannabis for anything. They want to stick with prescribed drugs because it's safe, they know exactly what it is, and it's more proven by studies. So a lot of times we've had some people in our group that are GPs that are not actually functioning as a GP, but they're actually more functioning as cannabis doctors. And they've had their records reviewed repeatedly, and they're always being audited, and it's a real problem for them. As a cancer doctor, nobody bothers me about anything I do. Because if I'm giving out opiates, they know people have cancer pain. If I'm giving out cannabis or supporting its use, I'll document that. There's no problem at all. And actually what's interesting is it's always good to be open with your doctors. So if you're using something, never feel embarrassed about it or bothered by it. It is legal. And we have to make sure that people know what you're on. Because if they don't, I've had people I'm covering for, you know, stuffy old doctor kind of thing I'm covering for. Next thing you know, they're telling me, oh yeah, I use cannabis all the time too. And I'm going, well, did you tell your doctor? I said, oh no, I don't want to tell him that. So sometimes people are more approachable, but you should always be telling people if you're using something. And same with other natural products. One of the problems with cancer is as soon as you get cancer, everybody and their dog comes to you with an answer. I don't know why. They won't do it for diabetes, heart disease, or anything else, but just cancer. They'll look on the internet in 10 minutes and come to you and say, I've got the answer. All you got to do is eat ginseng and IV vitamin C and cannabis and whatever else is new that year. And even after 17 years of university and 14 years of practice, I don't know all the answers. So I don't know how anybody without any training can look on the internet and think they found the answer. I always tell patients too, never entirely trust anyone who's got money to be made by you. So if they're selling you stuff, always wonder. Patients come to me, they don't pay a dime. Same thing with all of our drugs. And this allows us to freely offer what we need and let patients know, here's the risks, here's the benefits for every decision. And I'm not motivated to say, okay, I've got to give more chemo so I can pay off my mortgage. I can't afford a mortgage, this is Vancouver. So basically, the thing ends up being though, is that you always just have to always think about things as you're doing it and realize that with the lack of evidence, all these other things out there from scorpion venom to Mexican clinics that are offering cures for things that can't be cured are generally the same as our traditional snake oil salesman, basically. And it's a $20 billion a year industry just in North America. So people are making a lot of money, and it's not just cannabis, it's everything. I've seen arsenic poisoning and death in a 32-year-old in a Vancouver naturopath I met while in hospital, and we found it in her hair. And of course the person giving it didn't know that was in there, but they don't know what's in there. They did a study actually a few years back of about 140 natural products because they don't have to test it. As I tell patients, they test it as much as they test carrots. Do you know how they test your carrot? They pull it out of the ground and go, yep, looks like a carrot, and they throw it in. So this study looked at 140 typical things. Might have been echinacea, might have been melatonin, might have been ginseng or whatever else. But because they don't test it, this chemist guy went and figured out what was in them all. Now that would be great if everything was as labeled, but 40% of those products did not contain any of the main ingredient that was supposed to be in there. And that's disturbing. Like at least if I pay for it, I want to get echinacea, even though it doesn't work. And I want to get whatever else. Like if you get it, you want to know what you're getting. And that's what's really kind of scary. And beyond that, these are like Jameson vitamin companies, people like that, making lots of money. Other ones, the traditional Chinese herbalists and so on, they're there as well. And they're even less controlled because they're not selling things in a package. They're often mixing things together and we're not sure what's in it.